Have you ever loved someone so deeply that losing them felt like losing yourself? It begins quietly with a glance at your phone, a heartbeat too long in silence, a name that carries the weight of your entire sense of worth. You tell yourself, it's just love, that all love feels like this. The ache, the waiting, the constant calculation of how much to give without scaring them away. But deep down, you know it's something else. It's not love that makes your stomach twist at every unread message. It's fear, the fear of being forgotten, replaced, or left behind. You've built your world around their presence, the way a planet orbits the sun. Every moment of warmth feels divine. Every absence feels like death. You start to confuse love with oxygen, something you can't live without. When they pull away, even slightly, you panic. You overthink every word, every pause, every sigh that lingers in their voice. Their mood becomes your weather. Their approval becomes your peace. You tell yourself, this is what connection feels like, but secretly, it feels like drowning while pretending to swim. Psychologists call it emotional dependency, a state where your self-worth is so entangled with another person that you begin to lose the edges of who you are. Neuroscience explains that love activates the same reward centers in your brain as addiction. The brain doesn't distinguish between a drug that soothes you and a person who does. When they're near, you feel high. When they're gone, you go into withdrawal. It's a biochemical captivity disguised as devotion. But the story goes deeper than science. Somewhere in your past, love became a matter of survival. Maybe as a child, affection came with conditions. Maybe you learned early that love had to be earned through pleasing, through perfection, through silence. And now, as an adult, you find yourself repeating the same pattern, trying to be enough for someone who never asked you to be everything. You keep giving, hoping they'll stay, not realizing that real love doesn't need you to disappear to exist. There's a strange paradox in dependency. The more you cling, the more you lose. You reach for closeness, but your grip pushes them away. You beg for connection, but your fear turns intimacy into pressure. And when they finally leave, you don't just lose them, you lose the mirror in which you saw yourself. So you begin again, haunted by the same question. Was it love that kept me, or the fear of not being loved? The truth is that many people live their whole lives mistaking possession for passion, comfort for connection, and survival for love. But beneath the panic and longing lies a quiet revelation, waiting to surface that the love you've been searching for from others has always been the one you were meant to give yourself. And that realization, fragile, frightening, but freeing, is where your story truly begins. Do you remember the first time you felt invisible? Not the loud kind of pain, but the quiet one when someone you loved turned away, and the world suddenly shrank into silence. For some, that silence began in childhood. A small child sits on the edge of their bed, knees pulled to their chest, listening to voices arguing in the next room. The air feels heavy, unpredictable. They don't understand what's happening, but they learn something crucial. Love isn't safe. It can vanish without warning. Maybe their parent was kind one day and distant the next. Maybe love was something they had to earn by being good, quiet, pleasing. Every smile became a strategy, every apology a shield. Over time, they learned that affection had rules, that being too loud, too sad, or too needy could make love disappear. So they began to shape themselves around others' moods, shrinking their own needs, believing that the only way to be loved was to never be a burden. Psychologists call this anxious attachment, born from inconsistent caregiving. When affection is given unpredictably, a child learns to chase it endlessly. The brain wires itself for vigilance. Even as adults, these people scan faces and tones for danger, for distance, for any sign that love might be slipping away. Their nervous system becomes addicted to reassurance because, As children, reassurance was a rare currency. It's not vanity that drives their need, it's survival. You start to see how emotional dependency doesn't begin in romance. It begins in the nursery of unmet needs. That small child grows up believing that love and pain are intertwined, that to be loved, they must constantly prove their worth. And so, every relationship becomes a stage performance. They play the part of the perfect partner, the caretaker, the forgiver, anything to keep the peace they once feared losing. But deep beneath the surface, something tragic blooms, the belief that if I stop trying, I'll be left behind. That belief becomes the engine of every heartbreak that follows. The child who feared abandonment becomes the adult who fears solitude, and every time they sense distance, even a breath of it, their mind rewinds to that childhood room, to the silence that once felt like punishment. You might think time heals that kind of pain, but emotional memory doesn't obey the clock. It stays in the nervous system, in the way your hands shake when someone you love turns cold, in the way your chest tightens when a message goes unanswered. You're not reacting to the present, you're remembering the past, living it again through different faces. And so, before love ever fails you in adulthood, it quietly shapes you in childhood. Long before you fell for another person, you were already learning how to chase what should have been freely given. And that is where the story of dependency truly begins, in the eyes of a child who learned that love could vanish if they ever stopped earning it. There comes a moment in every relationship when you can feel the air changing. You start to breathe for two. Their happiness becomes your pulse. Their silence becomes your fear. You tell yourself it's love, that this is what devotion feels like. But deep down, something quieter whispers. You've become dependent, not devoted. You no longer know where you end and where they begin. You've learned to read them like weather, scanning their tone, their sighs, their pauses. When they smile, you feel alive. When they pull away, even slightly, you can feel your body tense as though the air has thinned. You adapt, you bend, you shrink. You become what they need before they even ask. Psychologists call it emotional enmeshment, but to you, it just feels like survival, because love, for you, was never safe. It was a test you had to keep passing. You wear the mask of the perfect partner. You anticipate their moods, their needs, their next move, not because you want control, but because uncertainty terrifies you. Your nervous system, wired by years of inconsistency, reacts to absence like danger. Neuroscience shows that the same brain regions activated in physical pain light up during rejection. That's why silence hurts like a wound, why distance feels like suffocation. It isn't just heartbreak, it's withdrawal from a drug your body has mistaken for air. You find yourself saying things like, "I just love deeply," or "I'm loyal to a fault." But underneath those words hides the truth. You love to avoid losing, not to truly connect. You care to prevent abandonment, not to be known. It's not passion, it's panic dressed as romance. You think you're holding them close, but what you're really holding is your fear, the same fear that once made you a child desperate for a parent's smile. Every gesture becomes a performance, every silence a signal. You start to measure love not by peace, but by proximity. You give until there's nothing left of you, and then you give a little more, believing that maybe this time it will be enough to keep them from leaving. But dependency has a cruel irony. The more you cling, the faster it slips away. Love cannot breathe under the weight of fear. And when it finally ends, when they walk away or simply fade, you don't just lose them, you lose the self you built around them. You stare into the mirror and see a face shaped by someone else's reflection. It's then you realize you weren't afraid of losing love, you were afraid of meeting yourself without it. Because somewhere, beneath the mask of devotion, lies the truth you've spent your life avoiding, that the love you give so desperately to others was meant to begin with you. And until you find it there, every connection will only remind you of the air you still don't know how to breathe on your own. Why does love, the very thing meant to free you, sometimes feel like captivity? Science has an answer, And it doesn't begin in the heart, it begins in the brain. When you fall in love, your mind releases a potent cocktail of dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. Each glance, each touch, each word of validation becomes a chemical rush, a hit of the same reward system activated by addictive substances. You think you're loving someone, but in truth, your brain is chasing its next high. The reward circuits that evolved to help us bond and survive now trap us in loops of longing. The more unpredictable the affection, the more hooked you become. Studies show that intermittent reinforcement of the unpredictable pattern of love and withdrawal creates the strongest form of emotional addiction. It's the same mechanism that keeps gamblers pulling levers, hoping the next spin will bring the reward. Except in your case, the lever is a person, a message, a smile, a touch, all tiny doses of hope that keep your nervous system waiting for the next reward. Psychologists call it anxious attachment, a survival strategy, born in childhood when comfort came and went like the tide. Your brain learned to stay on alert, scanning for signs of rejection, anticipating loss before it even happens. Neuroscience reveals that these attachment patterns become embedded in the amygdala and hippocampus, the regions of the brain that regulate fear and memory. That's why, even when you rationally know someone loves you, you can't stop fearing they'll leave. It's not weakness, it's wiring. Then there's codependency, the subtle merging of two nervous systems. You begin to feel what they feel, want what they want, hurt when they hurt. It's called emotional enmeshment, the blurring of self and other, and it gives the illusion of closeness, but at a cost. The more you fuse with them, the more you disappear. You become their emotional mirror, reflecting back their needs while neglecting your own. Modern research compares this dynamic to addiction because, in both, the brain learns to associate a single source with relief. You don't crave the person, you crave the calm they bring to your chaos. That's why withdrawal from a toxic relationship feels like detox. Your mind and body rebel against the loss of their familiar rhythm. But understanding this isn't about blame, it's about compassion. You're not broken for needing love. You were simply conditioned to believe it must be earned, chased, or kept alive through effort. Once you begin to see the science beneath the suffering, something changes. You realize this pattern isn't destiny, it's circuitry that can be rewired. And slowly, the question shifts from, why do I need them so much? To something far more profound, what part of me still believes I can't survive without them? That question, fragile and frightening, is the doorway to freedom. And beyond it lies the beginning of something new, the possibility of love without fear. There's a moment when love stops feeling like warmth and begins to feel like withdrawal. You don't notice it right away. It happens quietly somewhere between the endless apologies and the way you start to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. You tell yourself this is devotion, that all relationships take work, but somewhere deep down, a voice you've tried to silence whispers, this isn't love anymore, it's survival. You wake up each morning measuring the distance between you, a sigh, a delay, an unread message. Each one feels like a small collapse inside your chest. You start to adjust your tone, your laugh, your very breath, just to keep them close. The things that once made you vibrant now feel like threats because what if your independence reminds them they could live without you? So you hide your strength, dim your light, and trade honesty for peace. Psychologists call this the addictive cycle of attachment. Every reassurance you receive gives your brain a hit of dopamine, the same neurochemical that lights up when a gambler wins or a drug addict scores. Each moment of affection is a high. Each silence is withdrawal. You begin to crave the relief of their attention more than the person themselves. It isn't passion that drives you, it's dependency disguised as devotion. And so, you become the overgiver. You bend until your spine forgets what standing tall feels like. You tolerate small betrayals, brush off dismissiveness, and apologize for existing too loudly. You start to believe that love means never being angry, never asking too much, never needing more. But the cost of that kind of love is self-erasure, piece by piece. You disappear to preserve a connection that was never meant to save you. There's a haunting kind of jealousy that grows inside people like this, not of others, but of who they used to be before love became a cage. You remember laughter without permission, silence without fear. Now, even peace feels suspicious, because the absence of conflict doesn't bring calm, it brings panic. What if they're already drifting away? The shadow side of love is not hatred, it's exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones when you've poured yourself out so completely that even your own reflection feels foreign. You start to realize that your heart beats not out of joy, but out of habit, a reflex trained by fear. And that's the tragedy of emotional addiction. It mimics intimacy while slowly draining the life it promised to nourish. So you stay, gasping for the same love that's suffocating you, clinging to the hand that's quietly closing around your throat. Because somewhere in the darkness, the truth you can't face still waits the one question that shatters the illusion completely. What happens when the person you depend on becomes the person who breaks you? From the moment you first learn what love is supposed to look like, the world begins to lie to you. Every movie, every song, every story whispered through generations teaches the same illusion, that the highest form of love is the one that consumes you. You're told that real devotion means losing yourself, that if it doesn't hurt, it isn't real. You're promised that two souls must merge into one, that you should give endlessly, forgive endlessly, and hold on even when it breaks you. And so, you grow up mistaking emotional dependency for destiny. You've seen it in the films that shaped your idea of romance. The man who can't live without her, the woman who gives up everything for him. You're taught to equate obsession with loyalty, to confuse suffering with sincerity. The culture celebrates the lover who stays through pain, who sacrifices identity in the name of love. You're told that letting go is betrayal, that setting boundaries is coldness, that walking away from what wounds you means you never truly loved. This is what psychologists call romantic idealization, the collective myth that love should erase individuality. Neuroscientists have found that the same reward systems activated by addiction light up when we experience falling in love. And society, rather than teaching us to regulate this intensity, tells us to chase it endlessly. It glorifies the chemical chaos of infatuation, but never teaches the calm, patient work of emotional maturity. The world wants you high on love, not healed by it. Gendered expectations deepen this wound. Women are often taught to be selfless, to nurture, to hold, to fix. They're praised for endurance, for loving unconditionally, even when that love costs them peace. Men, on the other hand, are told that control and possession equal strength, that to need someone is weakness, and to be needed is power. Both lose one in silence, the other in armor. Both are trapped in a performance that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with fear. Philosophically, it's a strange contradiction. The culture celebrates merging two become one, yet true intimacy cannot exist without two separate selves. Dependency masquerades as unity, but it's really the slow dissolving of individuality. To disappear into another person is not to love them, it's to vanish beside them, and yet something in you begins to awaken when you see through the myth. You start to realize that love was never meant to be martyrdom, that the purest connection does not demand self-erasure, but self-awareness. It's a quiet rebellion to love someone deeply and still remain whole, to stand beside them, not beneath them, to say, I choose you, not I need you. Because real love does not chain you to another heart. It teaches both hearts to beat freely together, but never trapped. And that realization, that subtle act of defiance, is where dependency ends and true devotion begins. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness that comes from needing too much. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the kind that exists inside connection. You can be lying next to someone and still feel like you're standing in a cold, empty room. You refresh your phone, waiting for a message, a sign, a small confirmation that you still matter. And when it doesn't come, the silence becomes unbearable, as if love itself has forgotten your name. You tell yourself you shouldn't need this much reassurance, but you can't help it. Every moment of affection feels fleeting. Every pause feels like rejection. It's not attention you crave, it's safety. And yet, the more you reach for it, the further it slips. You start to live in a state of quiet panic, your emotions dictated by how loved you feel in that hour, your worth hanging by the thread of someone else's response. Neuroscience calls it emotional starvation, when the brain, wired for connection, receives inconsistent signals of care. The absence of warmth feels like pain, activating the same neural circuits that respond to physical injury. It's why rejection burns in your chest, why neglect feels like a wound that won't close. Your nervous system has learned to equate love with survival, and so every delay, every unreturned text, feels like a small death. In this dependency, you start to forget who you are without their reflection. You shape your tone, your words, your entire emotional landscape around what might keep them close. But love that demands your disappearance is not love, it's erosion. You become a ghost of your own longing, haunting the spaces between messages, watching the clock like it's a pulse monitor for affection. And when the relationship ends, as most dependencies do, the collapse is unbearable. You don't just lose them, you lose yourself. The version of you that existed through their eyes shatters. You look in the mirror and see only fragments, the pieces you gave away, the silences you swallowed, the small deaths you endured to keep love alive. Heartbreak, then, is not just emotional pain, it's an identity crisis. Psychologists call this attachment rupture, the collapse of a self that was built around another. The brain, stripped of its familiar reward cycle, spirals into grief, anxiety, even depression. But beneath that pain lies something strangely honest, the recognition that your hunger was never for them alone. It was for something far older, far deeper, the love you once promised yourself, but forgot to keep. And it's in that realization, in that quiet, shattered stillness, that something begins to stir. The awareness that this loneliness, however unbearable, is also a signal. It isn't asking you to chase harder or love deeper. It's asking you to turn inward, to finally meet the one person whose love you've avoided the longest yourself. Because only then does the need begin to quiet. Only then does the loneliness start to lift. There comes a point when the exhaustion becomes louder than the longing. When you finally understand that chasing love to feel whole is the most beautiful and brutal way of forgetting yourself. It's in that stillness, after the begging, the apologizing, the overgiving, that something inside you whispers, enough. That word doesn't sound angry, it sounds like oxygen. You begin to realize that healing doesn't start with someone new, or even with closure. It begins the moment you decide to stay with yourself, the moment you stop running from the silence you once feared. Because that silence, as heavy as it feels, is where your real voice lives. It's where your nervous system begins to unlearn chaos, where the body that once flinched at abandonment finally exhales. Psychologists call it self-regulation, the ability to soothe your own storm. It's not glamorous, but it's liberation disguised as solitude. You learn small things first, how to breathe when the phone doesn't ring, how to find comfort in your own company without mistaking it for loneliness. You start journaling, tracing your thoughts like footprints in the sand, realizing most of them belong to the frightened child who thought love was conditional. You meet that inner child with gentleness instead of shame. You tell them they don't have to earn love anymore, they just have to exist. Healing isn't about cutting off connection, it's about redefining it. You begin to see love not as oxygen, but as sunlight, something that helps you grow, not something you die without. Boundaries, once terrifying, become sacred rituals. You stop giving out of fear and start giving from fullness. You realize that saying no isn't rejection, it's protection. And with each act of self-respect, you replant yourself. Neuroscience shows that the brain, though wired by old pain, can rewire through consistent care. Every time you soothe yourself instead of seeking rescue, you're reshaping the neural map of dependency. You're teaching your mind a new truth that safety can come from within. There's a quiet power in that realization. You no longer crave intensity, you crave peace. You no longer need to be chosen to feel valuable. You no longer wait for someone to complete you because you've remembered you were never incomplete. And when love finds you again, and it won't come as obsession or fear. It will come as calm, as two whole beings walking side by side, not clinging to survive, but choosing to stay. Because real love is not a rescue, it's a recognition. It's what happens when two people who have learned to stand alone decide gently to walk together. And that is the quiet revolution of healing, to no longer need someone to breathe, and yet to still choose to share your air. You once believed losing them meant losing yourself. You thought love was meant to be all-consuming, that the mark of devotion was how much of you dissolved in their absence. But now, you see it differently. What you once called love was a mirror of your own hunger, the reflection of the emptiness you mistook for depth. It wasn't love that bound you. It was fear, the fear of vanishing without someone to see you. There's a certain peace that comes when you finally understand this. The panic softens, the noise quiets. You stop chasing the highs and lows that used to define your worth. You start to realize that real love doesn't demand self-erasure. It doesn't beg you to shrink, to please, to prove. Real love, the kind that endures, asks you to exist fully and freely. Psychologists often say that the deepest relationships are not those where two people merge, but where they stand side by side as distinct beings, securely attached, not entangled. Neuroscience supports this too. When your sense of safety comes from within, your brain no longer interprets love as risk. It becomes calm, steady, and alive, not a roller coaster, but a rhythm. Not a battlefield, but a home. You begin to see love as a choice, not a rescue. It's not the act of finding your missing piece, but of meeting someone who also learned to be whole. And from that wholeness, something sacred emerges, a bond untainted by possession or fear. You stop asking, will they stay? And start asking, how can we grow? You stop holding your breath every time they turn away, because you finally trust that your air is your own. There's beauty in that realization, in the quiet acceptance that love was never meant to chain you. It was meant to expand you. It's the kind of love that doesn't burn you alive, but warms you gently. The kind that doesn't demand that you forget who you are, but reminds you why you exist. And maybe that's what the journey was always, for not to find the one who completes you, but to remember the self you abandoned trying to be loved. To understand that being alone doesn't mean being unloved. It means being unbroken. So you stand now where you once knelt. You breathe where you once begged. You hold yourself where you once reached for rescue. The fear of losing love no longer haunts you because you've learned something far greater. The love you give, the peace you create, the life you live it, all begins with you. Because the truest love, the one that never changes, never consumes, never fades, is not the one you find in another person. It's the one that remains when everything else is gone. The one that says, softly but surely, you were never half a person,